learning coding in the basement and, like parents' basement and garages, that kind of sounds like the grassroots open source movement. So I'm curious if you remember when you first heard about free and open source software. Maybe it wasn't even called open source just yet.
So definitely it was after my teen years. I think the open source movements were definitely starting around that time, but I was unaware of them until later. I remember when I was in college, so GNU was something that we knew about, and that's, of course, part of the early open source movement. And I remember it in particular because a couple of friends and I, late night in the lab, would just get into these loops where we'd say, what does GNU stand for? And someone would say, GNU is not Unix. And they would say, but what does GNU stand for? GNU is not Unix. And we'd just do that like we were dumb college kids, basically, for way too long. But I don't know that I necessarily knew heavily what GNU implied at that time. Like, I think you're in college, you're given software, you don't really know whether the college is paying for it or not. I remember in graduate school becoming aware of Linux and that movement and being sort of intrigued by it, and also being a little bit puzzled from the perspective of, well, how do they make a living if they're not charging for this, right? So I definitely have some memories around, that's like when I think of myself as first hearing about open source and kind of as an alternative to Windows, which was pretty dominant at the time, and Mac to an extent as well. I feel like a light bulb moment for me, even though it was kind of later. I mean, I definitely knew more about open source by this point, but I don't know if you remember or ever saw the movie Antitrust with Tim Robbins, but it was a movie that came out in 2001 or so, where basically like the idealistic young open source programmer is being courted by the big closed source, for-profit software company, and it's basically a big sort of espionage, like tense movie kind of thing. And I remember that being sort of like, oh, okay, like this is a real thing. Like somehow it turned it from something that I was obviously using day to day into something that made it much more concrete for me somehow by telling this completely fictitious story. So that was kind of a turning point for me. But again, I certainly knew about open source before then, but somehow that was like an anchor when I was, reflecting on my history with open source for this interview.
That's interesting. I need to look up that movie. I probably saw it, but as someone being from Hungary, we like, if you see something on TV, for example, then it's most probably dubbed to Hungarian. So in terms of the movie titles, I never really know, because creative people like to do creative things, which means that sometimes the movie's title in Hungarian has nothing to do with the original English title or whatever language the movie was. They tried to make sure that the titles relate to the people in Hungary as opposed to where the movie is originating from. Right. And sometimes that lands in mysterious places, which is a head scratcher once you learn the original title of the movie. Like, where did our title come from?
Yeah, it would be fun to watch it again and see if it aged well.
So in terms of learning about open source, all the big revelations, was it still a bit more about the fact that there are people who are writing software that is available for free of charge? Or did you also, in the early days, like how much did you realize of the community that was behind that free and open source software?
I would say in those days, really not so much. I mean, I was a user of the technologies, but I don't know that I was aware of the open source movement and ecosystem much. I think I heard about it a little bit from some of my office mates who were operating systems researchers, and so I think they were more aware of some of that than I was. But I would say that my own experience with becoming more aware of it, more involved with it, started with one of my roommates when I was in grad school. At some point kind of pulled me aside and said, Brad, I'm a taxpayer and you're an academic, and I imagine that some of my taxes are paying for your research, and yet your project isn't open source. Like, shouldn't it be? I mean, don't we deserve to get access to the software you're writing on our tax dollars or whatever? And I think he had a really good point. But I remember being very stressed by this because, when you're a graduate student, there's a point at which you're just trying to do everything you need to do to get out, and it is a big challenge. And the thought of also open sourcing it and dealing with supporting open source users or contributions or thing like that was pretty overwhelming to me. But at the same time, I didn't really have a counter argument for him. So I don't remember exactly when it happened, but the language I was working on in graduate school, which was called ZPL, at some point we did start releasing it open source. To be clear, we had been releasing it for free before that, but in a binary only release, which of course can have portability problems and doesn't give you any confidence in what's behind the binary. And at some point we did start releasing the source for it. It was around the time, it was probably, I would guess, just after I graduated. So 2001, 2002, I would guess. But that was sort of one of my first personal interactions with thinking about doing open source myself. Even for a lot of the early part of my career, I was still fairly unaware of the size and scope and activity in the open source community. And I feel like for me, it was really when GitHub came out and became prominent that somehow that provided more of a sense of community, and we're all in this together, we're working on a similar platform. Not to say that every project is hosted by GitHub, but somehow that platform made it feel more like a thing that I became aware of and where we were part of and things like that in a big way.
So it seems like that open source was a bit maybe easier to discover and access once a platform like GitHub became a big and more widely known thing.
That's the way I think about it. And it's not to say that open source wasn't present or available before it. It certainly was. But somehow the community aspect of getting external contributors, having sort of an integrated place where your source is hosted and where your releases can be done and where users can file issues, just kind of bringing that all together in, what was a pretty nice platform compared to things we had been using before. I think that really was, for me, a bit of a light bulb moment in terms of, not just being sort of individual isolated people, but communities. And again, to be clear, I recognize in hindsight that there were big communities at that time. They just weren't ones that I was personally affiliated with. Open source has kind of been in my career, I guess you could say, a means to an end rather than a driving philosophy of the work. So it's been something I have used both as a user and as a developer, but was not something that I was deeply invested in from like a community hobbyist awareness kind of perspective.
I mean, I do love how you mentioned that conversation with your roommate, for example, like that sort of social aspect a little bit of open source in terms of those tax dollars and that kind of common good kind of thing. It's also interesting how you started the involvement in the open source ecosystem by open sourcing something rather than stumbling on a community, which I think might be a bit easier today, and the regular experience that someone just stumbles on a project, either from personal experience or their company told them so, and then there's the community and they need to figure out how to be part of that community, how to start participating, and all those kind of things, the contributions and the things that you mentioned. But it sounds like that you're taking more of the creator role in this ecosystem.